Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this session. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. To begin, I'll introduce myself. Good afternoon. My name is Verónica Hirsch. I'm Cho'okonanda. From my mother, I'm Chiricahua Apache. And I am pleased to work at the American Indian College Fund. I joined the College Fund in late November of 2022. Prior to that, I was self-employed as an independent consultant, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of working in that capacity for the College Fund for about 18 months or so before I was pleased to accept an offer of full-time employment. Several of our staff at the College Fund live and work remotely. Our headquarters are based in Denver, Colorado, but we do have several staff who live out of state, and I'm one of those staff. So I am participating today from the traditional homelands of the Thanatan and the contemporary tribal lands of the Basco-Yaquis. So I want to do due diligence and honor that I'm a guest in those territories. I do want to give a little bit of, I guess, housekeeping, so to speak. This discussion, I really hope it's a conversation this afternoon. I'm going to have a little PowerPoint, but it's really just meant for us to be able to refer to something, to keep our minds kind of at the task at hand, thinking about what does it look like to grow your own. We hear about this a lot, especially in tribal communities, and particularly within tribal college and university, or TCU for short contexts. This idea of how do we grow our own expertise? How do we create opportunities for people in our community to feel that they have the chance to use all of their talents, all of their wisdom, all of their expertise, to have a job that means something to them besides just offering a paycheck and financial security, to have an opportunity to maybe give back in a very intentional way to their community. So this idea of growing your own can encompass a lot of things. And so really that's what this conversation is about this afternoon. I will begin with just sharing a couple little slides to ground us. But at that point, I'm going to ask people if you're comfortable to turn on your video. If not, that's fine. You can unmute yourselves. You can utilize the chat to offer feedback, ask questions. This is really designed for us to be interactive and to really think about what this might mean. I do not pretend to have answers, but I really like to ask a lot of nosy questions. So I'm hoping that you feel the same way, that you're willing to engage in this conversation with each other, not just with me, because we have a brain trust here in this virtual environment today. You have all of your own lived experiences, your educational experiences, your work experiences, just your life experiences. And so I invite you to think about that as we consider this question of what does it mean to grow your own? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's go ahead and begin. So as I mentioned, the title of this, I'm going to call it a conversation, really, is this idea of growing your own intentionally and really what that looks like. So the first thing I want to offer to all of us, as I mentioned, at the College Fund, we are blessed and honored that we're able to support so many scholars, not only financially, but with a number of resources that are entirely free. So before I go further, shameless plug, please visit our website. In fact, I'm even going to put it in the chat right now. We have a number of resources that are available for you, for scholars, just for people that you know. And so you can just go to our website, collegefund.org. For whatever reason, my chat is not wanting to work. But if you just type in collegefund.org, have fun exploring our website. This particular portion of our website is within a drop-down menu that will say for students. And within that, you'll see different links. And this is the link to our webpage, myself and my colleague, Anna Marie Stevens, who's part of this conversation this afternoon. We are part of a 3-person team within career readiness and employment. And a lot of our work is guided by these 6 principles that you see on this screen. And so here they are. I'm going to skip to the next slide so you can see them a little bit bigger font. But these are our guiding principles. We call them the 6 R's. If you were in the keynote session just a moment ago, one of my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Ruth Plenty Sweetgrass She Kills, mentioned the R's. And these are the 6 R's that really ground and shape our work. So you see them here: respect, responsibility, reciprocity, relationship, reflection, and redistribution. And I put those guiding principles up there because I think that they can be very useful to return to as we engage in this conversation of what does it mean to grow your own? How do we have respect, let's say, for the wisdom in our own communities, our own tribal communities? Some of our tribal communities may also include a TCU, a tribal college or university. So how do we have respect for that? How do we use that interconnectedness that might exist between our TCU and a tribal community to our best advantage? What might that look like? How do we ensure that students are taking classes, earning credentials, earning certificates, earning degrees, if they're choosing to remain within the community, or let's say they're choosing to live elsewhere for a while. Maybe it's to complete another degree, a 4-year degree, a graduate degree. Maybe it's for a specific type of job that might not be available within the community or nearby. How do we ensure that no matter what, if that scholar, embarks on a journey, maybe it's a shorter journey within the community, maybe it's a longer journey outside of the community, how do we do something that is intentional to remind that person that they are loved, that they are respected, that they have a home, and that they are welcome to continue to maintain that connection, that interconnectedness? And then again, with the idea of responsibility, forgive my cat in the background, she decided she wants to do gymnastics. With our responsibility, how do we have this accountability to ourselves and to each other? How do we choose to show up, bringing our skills, as sometimes am silly about it? How do we show up and choose to show up with our best brains? How do we choose to do that so that we can, think of ways that we can communicate effectively with each other as we consider what it looks like to grow our own, to create opportunities for people to feel affirmed and to feel secure that they can use their strengths and their talents in meaningful ways for their relatives. And this idea of reciprocity, this R of reciprocity is probably, I won't say it's the most important principle, but I will say in the work that we do at the College Fund and specifically within career readiness and employment, we place particular emphasis on this R of reciprocity. And one of the reasons for that, I'll give you a little bit of a story why that is. Every semester, fall and spring semester, we administer a scholar survey. We're so blessed that we're able to support thousands, I think probably at last count, just under 2,000 scholars every academic year. And so in the fall and in the spring, we send out a survey. And the survey is pretty brief. We ask students, scholars, open-ended questions. And one of the questions that we have asked consistently has been, what is your reason for going to college? Why? Why does it matter to you? And it's open-ended. Scholars can just type in a response. And overwhelmingly and consistently for the past couple of years, about 78% of our scholars have said one of their main reasons for going to school, whether it's at a TCU or a mainstream institution, sometimes you'll hear it called a PWI or predominantly white institution. Regardless of what type of institution our scholars go to, they say that they want to give back. And because we take our scholars seriously and because we want to listen to our scholars and we appreciate the type of feedback they provide us, we said, well, you know what? Since it matters so much to our scholars, this idea of giving back, reciprocity, then it's going to matter to us. And so this is why I say the reciprocity R, it's not that it's the most important, but it is the R that the majority of our scholars have said and identified is really, really important to them and why they're making this sacrifice. They and their families are making this sacrifice for them to go on to earn a certificate or a degree. And then the other R's, as you see, relationship and reflection and redistribution. Again, with this idea of growing our own, how do we create safe spaces where people can explore, where people can be curious about what options they might have to use their degrees, to use their prior work experience in ways that are helpful and supportive to the needs that, let's say, a TCU or a tribal community might have. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next slide. And just a quick housekeeping, it's fine if you want to turn your camera on, just know If you're doing some stuff in the background, we can see it. So thank you. Okay, so here are the 4 questions to consider, and I'm just going to put these up. I'll leave these here for a moment. The first question, I'll read them out, and then at this point, then I'm going to ask people to, take a few moments to consider them. And as you consider them, if something doesn't make sense, feel free to unmute yourself. Feel free to utilize the chat. Feel free to interact basically at this point of this conversation. But some of the questions to consider as you see listed, one of the questions might be, who will take on my current responsibilities in the future? Let's say if you are a staff person who works at a TCU, at a tribal college or university, or you're an individual who works for a department within your tribe. How often have you thought about that? Because let's be honest, most of us are not going to stay in the same job forever for a number of reasons. Many people will be promoted because the longer you're in a position, the better you are at that job. And people will recognize that and say, hey, she, he, they seem to really get it. We'd like to keep them working for us. So maybe it's time for us to think of other ways that we can use their talents and their skills. Maybe they need to be promoted within this job or in this department or on this campus. Maybe they need to take on additional responsibilities and, of course, an increase in salary, an increase in wage. So chances are the job that you have now is not the job you're going to have forever, and that's a good thing. There could be other reasons why we might leave a job. Again, as I've mentioned before, there might be decisions having to do with earning additional degrees. There might be other family decisions, health decisions, caregiving decisions that need to be made. So even as myself, employed in the capacity that I have, my title is Program Officer for TCU Programs within Career Readiness and Employment at the American Indian College Fund. It's a mouthful. But even I think to myself, okay, I'm not going to be in this job forever. At some point in time, the title might change, the responsibilities might change. So how am I going to choose to show up just on a daily basis and think of, if I had to leave this job for whatever reason, let's say I'm promoted, let's say I have another life experience that requires me to leave this position for whatever reason, how would I ensure that things don't just fall apart? How would I choose to behave as a good professional relative? Who might, take my place, and beyond that, even if I know them or I don't know them? How can I be sure? What am I going to do? What type of R of responsibility am I going to take on to make sure that things make sense, when I leave this position, that I just haven't left things in a shambles, but I've been very intentional. I've documented my work. I figured out a process that makes sense to me and hopefully makes sense to other people. So this is maybe something for us to consider. I know we don't always consider it on a daily basis. I know I don't, but it is something to think about, especially as we ourselves are experiencing life changes, be that a promotion in our current job or another opportunity. Maybe you have, an ambition to travel overseas even, whatever the case may be. What does that look like, to think about who takes over my current responsibilities if I'm no longer in this role? And then next, I have this other question for us to consider. How can I help mentor or cultivate future Native professionals, not just to be leaders? I mean, it's really easy to drop that title. Oh, I'm a leader. He's a leader. She's a leader. They're a leader. But what does that mean? And regardless of tribal tradition, I think we all have stories about leaders, who have thought they've been leaders, and who have tried to be leaders. And maybe they have been not as effective as they would have been if, as part of their leadership, they prioritize being compassionate, being a compassionate person, a person who behaves with humility, a person who has integrity, basically a person who chooses to show up on a daily basis as a good relative. And in the context of work, I'm using this term or this phrase, a good professional relative. We hear those things batted around so many times that sometimes I wonder, are we really serious about what we're saying? Like, what does that really mean? Now, we're not trying to sound cute. What does that really mean to show up in a workplace? Sometimes workplaces are challenging for a whole number of reasons. There could just be a lot of work to do, and it feels like there's not enough hours or enough resources to complete it. There could just be some personality dynamics that are challenging for whatever reason. There could be different types of resource limitations, funding, space, time, whatever the case may be. And those challenges are not going to go away. So knowing that those challenges are going to exist in different ways at different levels in my role as a professional relative, what am I going to do about that? How am I going to still prioritize showing up as a good professional relative and what that means? And then this third question, something for us to consider, this idea of succession planning. That term succession just basically means like what comes after. So even as I'm having, the time of my life in my current role as an employee of the American Indian College Fund, if I personally think about, well, what does succession planning look like? Let's say in my job or in my organization, in my community, at my TCU. What does that mean? How does that R of responsibility, that R of having integrity and accountability and information transparency, how does that show up in a way that makes sense, in the way that I choose to treat my colleagues, my coworkers, my employees, maybe if I'm a supervisor, people who report to me? What does that look like? How do I create conditions, not just for myself to be successful, because that's not upholding the R of responsibility or the R of reciprocity. How do I choose to create conditions in my community, at my TCU, in my job that set up successful opportunities for other people who will come after me? How do I do that without feeling afraid that somehow I'm going to lose my job because I'm being, such a good relative that I'm making it easier for everybody else? How do I confront that? I mean, I know some of us are smiling at that, but that can be a real concern, a real fear. If I'm so concerned with making other opportunities for other people, for them to be successful, for them to shine, does that somehow take away my brilliance? I don't know. So that's something to consider. What would that succession planning look like if I choose to show up as this good relative, good professional relative? And then lastly, how can we use available data? Data is just information. I know sometimes when we hear that word, it sounds kind of intimidating, but it's just information. It's information to help us make an informed decision. So where are those sources of information? Who's collecting what? And what are we collecting? Why are we collecting it? Is it because, oh, well, it's required, this is a grant-funded situation, it's a federally grant-funded situation, so the feds require it, and we don't like them, but we have to do it, blah, blah, blah. Are there other opportunities, though, for us to think about what is the information we want to know for ourselves? That's not required from a federal agency or a tribal department, but it's just something I want to know as a person who's part of this community. I want to know it as a person who's part of this TCU campus. I want to know as a person who works for this organization. What might that look like? How will that information be helpful as we consider some of these questions? So with that, I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to stop talking because I don't want to talk at anyone. This, as I mentioned, as I said at the beginning, and if you just joined, I'll repeat it here. This session is really more so of a conversation. Like I said, I'm offering maybe some nosy questions. I'm not pretending to have answers. I will later on, as we have a conversation with each other, provide some resources that I hope will be helpful. And hopefully if you find them helpful, great. If you don't, no worries. But I'm really interested to hear what all of you think, as we consider this idea of growing our own expertise within our tribal communities, on our tribal college and university campuses, in our own jobs that we already have. What does that mean? What does that mean to you? So take a few moments to consider it, and please feel free to unmute yourselves. Feel free to use the chat. I'm going to leave these questions up here, but I'll be checking the chat just to see if anybody has something that you want to offer. So take it away. And I realize that people may not have considered these questions before, so I certainly don't expect everybody to feel like, oh, I have to answer this or not. But is there something that jumps out at you? Do these questions seem weird to you? I'll just start with that. Let's just be honest. Are these weird questions to ask? What do you think? And thank you for the person who typed in the chat. I think that's a very honest response, and thank you for that response. I wasn't supported as a graduate student at my tribal college with the trauma I endured. And first of all, I want to say, I apologize. I'm sorry that you experienced that. I don't think you're alone in that by any means. In fact, there's a whole body of research that has been done by several Native scholars, and one in particular, Dr. Chris Nelson, who talks about the very harsh reality that many of us Native scholars, graduates, regardless of where we graduated from, whether it's a tribal college or university or a mainstream so-called predominantly white institution, that for many of us, for various reasons, we've endured trauma, different types of trauma. And so she talks about, and she offers this conversation about what does it look like to create conditions where Native people can graduate without harm? I think that's very powerful. This idea of what needs to happen to make sure that we as individuals and our own relatives who are also, going through the process of earning degrees and certificates, that they're able to graduate without harm, without that type of trauma. So I think that's important. It's important to consider. And even as we have those personal stories of trauma, to think about, first of all, to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge our emotions with that. So thank you for offering that. Thank you for your vulnerability. I appreciate that. And then also to think about, so what does that mean now as an individual? The resiliency that you still have, even as a person who suffered trauma, not minimizing the trauma, but the resiliency that you have, that you're still here, and you're still moving forward in your professional journey. Let's see. Looks like we're having some fun interaction in the chat. And thank you for this question. Yes, this idea of succession planning. What does that mean to you? I gave a little bit of a snippet of how I would think of it. This idea of how do I create conditions for the next person who will take on my job responsibilities? How do I do that in a way that doesn't somehow feel threatening to myself of, oh my gosh, and am I making sure I get fired? Or I'm out of a job? How do I not maybe feel that fear? Or if I feel that fear, what do I do about it? So I think that's also really good, a question to consider. What does succession planning mean to you? Let's see, we have a few other responses in the chat. I agree, thank you. The more education you have, the better prepared you are in general for anything. And I appreciate that. Thank you for that. I think I would tend to agree, regardless of whatever an individual is studying at whatever level, a certificate, a degree program, continuing education, whatever the case may be. I think having the mentality that in that experience, not only, I'll use me as an example, not only am I learning new stuff, which is in itself can be fun and challenging, I'm also learning how to learn, especially if I have colleagues, classmates, an instructor, all these different people with their own different lived experiences, their own personalities. So I'm learning new subject matter, new content, but I'm also learning, how to, as an individual, operate in those spaces with people that maybe before taking that class, I didn't know them before. But now we're in this space where we're learning together. We're trying to learn together. We're trying to be effective in that. We're trying to create conditions where all of us can learn. We can truly learn. And regardless of our learning style, that we are hopefully moving towards mastering that new material, that new subject matter, that, we can show up for each other to help each other do that as well, regardless of our learning style differences or communication style differences or different life experiences. I think I tend to agree with that statement as well. Thank you. Let's see. And I think, yes, it's sometimes, a reality where when we come to realize that a certain environment, an institution, a job, even a degree program simply isn't for us. How do we cultivate that attitude, not of I have failed at this, but I have learned what is not for me? And I personally have that as an experience, as a lived experience. When I started out my undergraduate education, I really thought I wanted to be an environmental engineer. And I stuck with it for a year until I took a circuits class. And then I remembered I burst into tears and I called home crying. This is the early 1990s. So my mother and my maternal grandmother were part of my household. They were a few hours away from me. And I called home crying, and my mom got on the phone. She's like, hold on, your grandma's going to get on the other phone in the bedroom. And so I'm crying to my grandmother and to my mother. Oh, I'm a failure. I'm a student on scholarship. Oh my gosh, my life is over. What am I going to do? Blah, blah, blah. And both my mother and grandmother encouraged me. They said, you know what? First of all, let us pray for you. And they did on the phone. And they said, secondly, don't feel that you're a failure. Just realize that it only took you a year to figure out what isn't for you. That's all. And that really helped me reframe instead of feeling like I'm a failure. Oh my gosh, my scholarship's going to go away. My life is over. I still felt scared and I still felt overwhelmed. And I felt that I was in a better mental space that I could decide, well, what do I really care about? And I know what I cared about was environmental science. It wasn't necessarily the engineering part of it, but more so this pure science of it and the policy. That's what I cared about. I didn't want to manipulate the environment. I wanted to protect it. And so then I was able to redirect my focus and choose a different major that was more aligned to who I am as a person and what my interests are. So I think it's important to realize, yes, even as we might be in a situation where we come to the conclusion that that environment is not for us, that we still have the ability to make good decisions for ourselves and decide what is better suited for us, where we are at that point in our lives, that point in time. And thank you for this comment in the chat. I really like the second question. This is something I'm really trying to work on. The organization I work for, being someone who is not Native, I feel that I have a great deal of work to do. Showing up, learning, and participating is a great way to start. I will continue to converse with my Native coworkers to continue finding learning opportunities. Thank you. Thank you for that honest response and that very thoughtful response, because the reality is for all of us, Native people and non-Native people, whether or not we're working in Native or non-Native environments, none of us has all the answers. I think that's a pretty obvious statement that we can say that. I can say that as is being said now. I can say it with my whole chest. None of us has all the answers. So the reality that we have something to offer each other, and that's where that R of reciprocity that I mentioned at the very beginning comes into play. Reciprocity doesn't mean I have everything that I need and I can do it all by myself. That is not reciprocity. That is called loneliness. Super lonely if I think I don't need anyone and I have all the answers and I can do it all by myself. That's not reciprocity. Reciprocity is I know something about something and I'm going to do my best. And the stuff that I don't know very well, I'm going to think about who can I ask for help? Who can I ask for help? Again, being mindful of their time, their responsibilities, their priorities. But if I approach them with humility and respect and say, hey, person, I'm having a bit of trouble here. Do you have any recommendations for me or any advice? And to also realize that, everybody, all of us at some point in time are going to have a bad day. And so even if the response is a little bit short of like, leave me alone, don't bother me, whatever, how do we give each other grace? That's another important part of reciprocity. It's realizing I don't have all the answers, but if I approach colleagues with kindness, compassion, humility, empathy, and I give them grace, and I trust that they're going to do the same for me, well, then we have a greater opportunity then to benefit each other, where one person understands something really well, I don't understand it as well. They're willing to be patient with me, to offer suggestions for me, to build up my expertise in that area, and that I can do that. So that is, I think, something that is also that as part of this idea of how we grow our own, something to bear in mind as well. Let's see, I'm going to go down a little bit more. Creating programs that are self-sustaining regardless of staff turnover. Elections, yes, election outcomes, absolutely. That's another thing I think that's important as we entertain this idea of growing our own. Myself, I've witnessed, and I've also been in certain circumstances in different work environments where you have a person who's just amazing. Like everybody loves that person, everybody, I'm going to put that in quotation marks. There's always a couple haters, but that's okay. We're going to give the haters grace too, because that's what we do with reciprocity. We'll have some grace and some empathy and compassion, even for the haters. But in certain situations, it seems like that program or that effort or that whatever, is being led by an amazing person or like a small group of people. And it just feels like those people are the rock stars. And like what we do without them, oh my gosh. And the reality is at a certain point in time, and I'm not trying to be negative and I'm not trying to be morbid, at a certain point in time, for whatever reason, that amazing, wonderful, beautiful person will no longer be in that role for whatever reason. And so it's important for all of us as we're thinking about growing our own to not just rely on that one person or small group of people who are those rock stars and are amazing. They have so much charisma. People are just drawn to them. The danger with basing everything upon one or a few charismatic people is if there is turnover or departure for whatever reason, we don't want to have unintentionally created a situation we feel that we're scrambling, that no one knows what to do. And so I think this gets back to that third question that I offered is, what does that succession planning look like? Maybe you're the rock star in your community or at your TCU or in your department. And if you are, wonderful. Thank you for being that amazing, charismatic individual. So then my question to you is, how are you going to create conditions for whoever? Maybe one person can't do what you've been doing alone. Maybe it takes a group of people to do what you've been doing. So what are you going to do since now to make sure that for whatever reason, if you get promoted, if you leave for whatever reason, it doesn't have to be a negative one, that things don't, just go to shambles because you're no longer that amazing rock star in that amazing role. I think that's also something important to consider. Let's see. These are important questions that might go unacknowledged. Yes, in transitional periods. Thank you for that. Yes, and I think it's important, that idea of checking in with ourselves. I know sometimes, myself included, we get busy, we get so caught up in the priorities and the deadlines, and all of those things are valid and important. Yes. And it's also important for us to choose to create a little bit of time, that art of reflection. Now, for me, I don't know what it is. I have two locations where I seem to reflect a lot. One of them happens to be when I'm driving in my car. I think just because, I'll play music sometimes I will, sometimes I won't. But for me, there's something about that activity that just makes me be in a reflective space. Maybe you have something that you do. Maybe it's gardening, maybe it's cooking, maybe it's beading. It could be anything. But for me, I feel like I do some of my best work, some of my best thinking and reflecting when I'm driving my vehicle. But it's important to check in with ourselves, whatever that looks like, and for however long, it might just be a few minutes at a time. And this idea of succession planning like leadership, yes, looking back at some of those traditional leadership examples and models, that can be very helpful. I really appreciate this comment. Having to unravel ourselves out of that mainstream idea of what leadership looks like, maybe in that hierarchy. I would offer, I guess, as an example, depending on the tradition, but I'm going to, I guess, call to mind an example of medicine. Somebody who's a medicine person who would realize, I'm not going to be, here forever. Again, not to be morbid and not to be negative. And so then that person takes on the responsibility of looking within the community who seems to have this gift, God-given, creator-given, who seems to have the aptitude, the spiritual strength to take on, let's say, the responsibility of being a medicine person. And how then does that person get identified, brought in whatever context, and then taught, to serve effectively in their own way, with their own unique skills, their own unique insight, how that was acknowledged, and how can we take inspiration from that and put that in a contemporary context that maybe isn't necessarily looking at who's going to be the next healer or medicine person, but who's going to be the next department coordinator for something. What might that look like? Let's see, I'm going to go down a little bit more. Yeah, data, that information, again, data. It's just knowledge, information, and how we're going to share it, what we're going to do with it, how it's important, how it keeps us connected. I wholeheartedly agree. And yes, I think, some of these questions, like I said, we don't always have opportunity for whatever reason. I don't think it's intentional necessarily, but I think sometimes some of these questions, excuse me, might feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? Maybe for whatever reason they might feel uncomfortable to ask. Maybe I might find myself in a work environment where I don't feel safe, truly, like in terms of job security, asking these questions. That's a valid concern. That's an absolutely valid concern. And I would still offer, if I don't feel safe for whatever reason, job security might be a reason to suggest these questions to colleagues. That doesn't mean that I can't still consider them and reflect on them for myself. That doesn't mean that somehow I just have to say, oh, well, too bad. There's no one for me to have this conversation with. I think it still can help inform, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, how I'm going to choose to show up as a good professional relative. I can't necessarily worry about or control if somebody else is going to show up as a good professional relative, but I can absolutely control how I'm going to choose to model that for myself. Let's see, a couple more responses. And no worries about any distraction. No, I was just making a joke. Please don't apologize. No concerns there. And yes, thank you. Thank you for reminding us that really that primary connection that grounds us is going to be that connection to land. And that gets back to that R of relationship, not just relationship with human relatives, but all that is the cosmos, our ecosystems, our specific land bases, however we define community, and knowing that we are part of multiple layered communities, plural. So yes, being mindful of that, and considering that as we ground ourselves in these conversations. So thank you so very much for all of this really lovely, thoughtful feedback. I'm going to go ahead and advance to a couple more slides, just because I want to chat a little bit about this last question that I've offered for consideration, how we can use available data to help us make informed decisions. Some of the data that we can use and some of the resources that we can use to make informed decisions, I'm happy to say you can just go to our College Fund website and find some of this information. And again, this information is not exclusive to our collegefund.org website, but we intentionally link a page on our website to it. So here you can see this map, and it's a fun interactive map. I encourage you to take it for a spin, and you can see all the tribal colleges and universities that are currently accredited and active listed here. And I just love looking at this because I'm appreciative of one of the comments in the chat, acknowledging the land, our mother, our first mother, as that source of life and inspiration and protection. And just to be able to see the TCUs, across this particular landscape, to me is just really thought-provoking and really inspiring. So here, as you can see, when you click on any one of these little links, you'll be able to see the main campus. Several of these main campuses have satellite campuses, which is lovely. And I offer that here because, especially if, let's say, you are employed in a travel department or at a TCU, and let's say there's a vacancy coming up within your area of responsibility or on your campus or in your community, you might consider like, well, who might be earning a degree or a certificate or a something in one of these areas? How might we connect with that person who is a graduate, especially if they're, if we have an entry-level position or a mid-level position for an individual who has that type of background and expertise? How can we be intentional about not just knowing where TCUs are located, but thinking creatively of thinking, well, how would we connect with their recently graduated alumni? How do we ensure that we create more accessible opportunities for those alumni to get jobs within their degree fields? And the next slide is a bit more of the same. So in this case, you're not seeing TCUs, but we know that there are some of these mainstream institutions that have Native-focused degree programs. And not all of those Native-focused degree programs are American Indian Studies programs or Native American Studies programs. Some of them are discipline-specific. There is a specific program for Indians into medicine at the University of North Dakota. And that program is very broad. It's not just for people necessarily who are only wanting to go to medical school and earn an MD, but for people who are interested in becoming a nurse practitioner, maybe in engaging in certain types of medical research. There's programs that have to do with tribal governance and management. So there are a number of different programs. That's just to name a couple. There are a number of programs having to do with Indigenous environmental science. So environmental science and policy through a Native lens, from a Native perspective, which I think is enormously powerful. As I mentioned, that's where my degree grounding is in. So I specifically am interested in things like that. But also to think about, okay, people who are coming out of these degree programs, earning these degrees, how are we trying to be intentional about connecting with them? How are they hopefully being intentional about being connected to their home communities in whatever capacity? So that we're not losing, we don't have this brain drain. We're not losing the potential to create opportunities for all of us to benefit, them to be able to apply the knowledge that they've gained working within a tribal community context or at a TCU. And creating more of this kind of information transparency and accountability to each other so that, one pot of effort, a lot of people can benefit. How can we, again, choose to center and prioritize what it means to be a good professional relative in all these different ways? Another feature that we offer at the College Fund is a way for people to connect with each other. And so I strongly encourage you, if you have not created an account, if you please be sure to go to this URL address that's listed. We host a virtual mentoring network, a specific platform. And this is not just for current students, it's for people who have already graduated, earned their degrees, people who are already in the workforce in various industries across the country. And this is really a great opportunity for people to create a profile, for you to indicate what your interests are. You type in keywords, see what comes up, and you can find other people who are like you, who have a similar interest, who are maybe studying that, or who have graduated with a degree in that particular interest that you have, or who are already working in that specific area, so that you can then engage in the art of relationship building with maybe a colleague in a virtual environment. But this is also a great opportunity to build professional relationships with future graduates. Thinking of, if I am in a position to, let's say, hire people to come work at my tribal college or university, or I'm in a position to encourage people to look at the vacancies that we are posting in our tribal community and our various departments, this might be a good way to connect with people who have that expertise, and to also be able to use this virtual mentoring network to post job vacancies that you know of that might be of interest to other Native people within this virtual space. And then lastly, I'm going to just go quickly through some other things. Some of you might already be familiar with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, the fact that they provide weekly updates. On those weekly updates, you can scroll through the information. You can click on different interactive links that will also take you to job posting areas of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or AHEC website. And the same thing is true at the Tribal College Journal. They also provide a job board. So that's another way to think about, how are we making sure that our tribal college graduates, our Native people who maybe didn't graduate from tribal college, graduated from a mainstream institution, but would like to work within a tribal community context, within a TCU environment, or within a tribal community, that they can be aware that, oh, these opportunities exist, and that they should consider them as part of their professional journey. And lastly, I want to provide some information about certain publicly accessible websites that are at the federal level. And it's one that I've had a lot of fun most recently exploring, and it's called, it's part of this larger network called the Longitudinal Employment. I'm blanking. Actually, it's on the next slide, but the LEHD hosts this specific area called this Local Employment Dynamics Partnership. And within it, you can see the URL is listed there. It is a voluntary partnership, but it provides a lot of information, data, where you can have fun. You can look at interactive maps. Most of the states are partners in this type of environment. Not all of them are. But what I love about it, and I'm going to show it to you on this next slide, it's part of this larger entity called the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics. And it's one of the divisions at the US Census Bureau. It gives amazing information about what happens when somebody graduates from a specific college or university. It gives all this type of information, their degree, their major, where they went to school, where that school is located. And you can simply go to this really fun interactive map, which I'll show on the next slide, to find out a bunch of this information. And one of the reasons I think that's so powerful, I'm going to go to the next slide, is you can see what happens here. I've taken a little screenshot for the state of Colorado. You can see with a certain type of degree level, in this case, a bachelor's degree, what the options are for certain fields. So you see over here, social sciences, see over here, business management, marketing, etc. And it is an amazing generator of information that, let's say, if you work at a tribal college or university, or you work within a tribal department, to think about what are the opportunities, potential opportunities for our Native relatives who are coming out of these degree programs, whether at a TCU or at a mainstream institution. What are some of the opportunities that exist for them, and where those might be located in a particular state, in a particular area? You can see some of these areas of work: mathematics, education, biology, history, so on and so forth. So it's just really a fun tool to explore. And even if for somebody who is currently a scholar in your degree field, you might be interested in looking at this as well, to think about, well, what if I'm graduating with a degree in natural resources and conservation? What might be the outlook for me in a particular state, my home state, a state next to my home state, a state across the country, whatever the case may be? It's a really powerful information tool to utilize. And I think, again, getting back to the original intent of this conversation of what it looks like to grow our own intentionally, the more information we have, the better able we are to make informed decisions about how we can create conditions to grow our own, to ensure that we are graduating people who have this wisdom, and that we're creating opportunities for them to share their wisdom and insight in a meaningful job that continues to benefit Native people, whether in a tribal community, at a TCU, or elsewhere. So with that, I'm going to look back in the chat, and I see there's also some stuff in the Q&A. I see one of the questions in the Q&A. Can you talk about succession planning? I'd like to know more. Yes, and I think we have some great feedback in the chat on succession planning as well. So with that, I would love if anybody feels, safe. Hopefully you do, and if not, that's okay. If you want to unmute yourselves, if you have information from lived experience, personal experience that you'd like to share, criticism, if you think like, oh, this seems really naive, and maybe it's too optimistic, it's not grounded in reality to have this conversation, that's okay too. This is why these types of conversations are important to have, because they are tricky and they are challenging. So if anybody has anything to add, please feel free to unmute yourself and offer your insight. And I'm going to scroll down a little bit more to the chat. Oh,
I would like to share if that's okay.
Yes, please, please.
I just want to greet everybody with a warm handshake from my heart. And I just, coming from, for me, I have a lot of trauma in these systems, and from both sides, from non-Indigenous and Indigenous. And so I just feel it's important to kind of share about that, and just to encourage everybody in a good way that if given the right creative safe space, we just need to go back to our roots and things that our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our great grands, they all taught us, and our parents, they taught us these things. But for some reason, we go into these systems, especially education, and we endure trauma. And that trauma takes us out of our center. And when we're not in our center, we're not being creative. We can't create from our center when we're not in our center. And as Indigenous relatives of the stars and the earth, we are creators. That's who we are. We are creators in the stars, and we came here to earth to create as well. And so when we're talking about the succession, that's what we need to nurture. We need to nurture that within ourselves, and provide that space for the future ones coming up, so that their trauma is lessened. And our experience with that didn't go for nothing. So I just want to share that in a good way. And I just want to encourage everybody in a good way, and let you all know I'm very proud of each and every one of you. And I'm thankful for this space. Thank
you. Wopila, thank you. Thank you so much for those words, and thank you for expressing that vulnerability. I agree, depending on different circumstances and environments, unfortunately, I think many of us have experienced some of that lateral violence for whatever reason. And that's not to minimize that. That's not to say, oh, what happened? Get over it, or it's in the past. No. But I think for myself, where I've chosen to try to redirect some of that hurt, and it was, legitimate hurt, is to think about and remind myself, well, I've just experienced a life lesson of how I will never be, of how I will never treat another relative, especially another, a relative, maybe in my case, a woman in science, a woman in STEM, or a younger relative. And I think it's very helpful, to be reflective on that, to acknowledge, yes, the harm that happened to us and that we endured. But as was mentioned previously, to just allow that and to redirect that energy that came from a negative space, and to reframe it and rechannel it to a positive, productive, and healing type of energy, where we can say it has happened, but I can choose to break that cycle, in my own decisions, in my own way of choosing to show up with authenticity, with respect for myself and for others, And with that genuine commitment to this idea, this R of redistribution, of how can I cultivate a seven generations, a multi-generational mindset? How can I think about the legacy that I want to leave as a relative in all the different ways I'm a relative, as a literal relative, biological relative, as a chosen relative, as a community member, as a professional relative, that I can be reflective of that and that I can make those intentional decisions. And I can do that in a way that doesn't support, a capitalistic notion of professional environment or job. Yes, I have a job and I have needs and, I need housing security and food security. And I can still bring all of that knowledge and wisdom as was shared by the beautiful comments we just heard a few moments ago. And I can bring them to bear, right, in this way that is helpful and supportive, not just to myself, but to those around me. So I thank you all so much for your time. I thank you so much for being so intentional about participating in the chat. I thank you for stepping out of your comfort zone. I thank you for being vulnerable. And I wish all of you a wonderful rest of your afternoon and enjoy the conference. So with that, if there's nothing else, thank you so much, everyone.